locally grown, David Taffet. Well, I say locally grown, he's from New York, but we're not going to talk about that part. But most of you know David from his byline in The Voice. You've probably read him 1,000 times in The Voice, and you might know him from his voice because he is the voice on Lambda Weekly, which is the KNON-FM radio station. Y'all listen to that? It's amazing. It's the longest running LGBT talk show in the country, right here in Dallas. Some of us have known David by his work for various organizations and boards, including the Dallas Gay and Lesbian Alliance, Equality Texas, and the Resource Center. And of course, all of those organizations are operating under different names because David did this so very long ago. And he's been an active member and is still an active member in the Congregation of Beth el Binah. So David is our most recent recipient of the Black Ties Kuchling Humanitarian Award. So David, the man.
I really didn't have my sights set on being a gay journalist and radio broadcaster when I wrote for the Albany Student Press and later Sweetfire, my school's short-lived communist newspaper. Instead, one thing led to another. I like to say my Dallas Voice writing career and my KNON radio sideline began when I applied for a retail job on Fifth Avenue in New York on a snowy day in January 1978, 5 years before there was a Dallas Voice or a KNON. After an interview and an aptitude test, I was offered a position in a management training program with the Custom Shop in Rockefeller Center. Having recently graduated with a degree in English and art, it wasn't what I was looking for, but it was snowing and it was cold, so I figured, what the hell. I can look for something else when the weather clears up. But once I began working in the store on Fifth Avenue, I really found I enjoyed it. We had lots of celebrity customers like Maury Amsterdam from the Dick Van Dyke Show. He was a regular and always threw out one-liners whenever he was in the store. Richard Chamberlain, who supposedly came out in 2011, always shopped with his boyfriend. The store closed at 6 o'clock and Broadway was within walking distance, so I saw everything that season. 6 months later, though, I was given my own store in Atlanta, and a year after that, I was transferred to run the Custom Shop in North Park here in Dallas. North Park was nice, but had fewer celebrities, although Ross Perot was a regular and the cast of the show Dallas were customers. But it was farther from Broadway, and after 5 years with the company, it was time to move on. Because of my experience, I got an opportunity to go to work for a competitor at the wholesale level, and I covered a 5-state area and was flying to my account, so I began using a travel agency called the Reservation Desk, which was located in an old house on Fairmont Street on Oak Lawn, where there's a 7-Eleven and an Exxon station now. Well, 5 years later, I became a partner at the Reservation Desk with Bruce Jaster and Michael Baird, and I was taking advantage of my travel benefits. And we advertised in the Dallas Voice, and I mentioned to Robert Moore that I'd love to do a travel column. So I talked to Dennis Vercher, our editor, who asked me to write a few sample columns. That was March 1989, and my column appeared monthly for the next 10 years. During that time, I was writing about museums and the arts and places I traveled, and Dennis began assigning me to cover some local arts, and I began writing for the paper more frequently, which is how a retail job in Rockefeller Center in New York led me to writing for the Dallas Voice. A year later, in 1990, Bill Travis was hosting Lambda Weekly, which had a slightly different format back then. Mostly they played music by gay and lesbian artists, they did short interviews, and I began doing a recorded travel segment. When Bill and his co-host, Alonzo Duralde, both quit the show about a year later, they found Steve Walters, who had some radio experience, to take over the show. I showed up on Steve's first day just to ask if he wanted to continue doing the travel segment. Steve was sweating bullets, so I sat down. I didn't continue the travel segment. Instead, I became his co-host, and I've been doing Lambda Weekly every week since then. Over the next few years, we did some innovative programming. In 1993, I went to the March on Washington equipped with a cell phone. That phone, which was the size and weight of a brick, needed 4 batteries to last through one show. Texas stepped off near the Washington Monument just as I heard our theme song begin to play on the phone, and I wandered through the Texas delegation as we marched, and I found people to interview. State Representative Glenn Maxey was at the front of the group, and I explained to him I would ask him the first question, and I'd hand him the phone, and Steve in the studio would continue asking questions. Glenn didn't quite get it. It's a phone, I explained. So what do? He asked. You just talk into it, and you'll hear Steve in the studio on the other end of the line, I explained. He tried it, and he was shocked that he could be walking down the street in front of the White House in Washington, D.C., and be talking to someone in Dallas, Texas, who was broadcasting what he was saying across the country. As those newfangled cellular phone device things became more popular, and some of you might have one now, we began broadcasting the Pride Parade, Life Walk, and all kinds of other Sunday afternoon events for years. We've also had guests in the studio, hundreds of them, local and national. When city council candidates Ed Oakley and Craig McDaniel were on, they both said those were their first live radio interviews. Chastity Bono was in town for National Coming Out Day and said it was her first radio appearance talking about being an out lesbian. Now, I've rarely had to use the dump button, but we had to keep bleeping Charo. She had one great story, though. She talked about walking down the Castro one day, and one of the bars was having a Charo look-alike contest, so she entered. And she lost. But she told wonderful stories about how her career began, and after she was on, she hand-wrote me a letter, thanking us for being the first ones to ever interview her, asking about her, and not expecting her to do her whole coochie-coochie character. In 1997, Steve got into an argument with the station manager who fired him. So to save the show, I said I knew how to run the board, I could continue Lambda Weekly. So they gave me the show, and before the next Sunday, I learned how to run the board because I had never run it before. Since then, LaRon Landis has co-hosted with me, and a few months later, the late Patty Fink joined. And no, Patty is not dead. If she were, I'd call her the dead Patty Fink. And as anyone who knows Patty knows, she's late for everything. 2 cars is what's kept her relationship with Aaron alive. And she always says that she'll continue hosting the show even after she's dead, but then she'll be even later, but that's another story. After the reservation desk went the way of most travel agencies, I had several retail businesses, but in between businesses, I've worked on staff with Dallas Voice. Rather than just freelancing, I actually served on staff several times, and my latest stint started with the paper's 25th anniversary, and we're coming up on our 30th this May. Dennis is gone. Robert retired last summer, but our new publisher, Leo Cusimano's been with the paper 20 years, and company president Terry Thompson has been with us almost as long. So things at the paper are pretty much the same as they've always been. Now, my favorite stories in the paper are those when I get to tell people's stories. When we were looking for a good Valentine's story one year, I found a couple who both arrived at reparative therapy at the same time. Their eyes met, and they fell in love. They spent 6 months together there at reparative therapy until they ran away to Dallas, built a life for themselves, had a big wedding at Cathedral of Hope and a reception at the W Hotel, and after telling me their story, made a number of other local and national appearances. They even got a call from Oprah's people and appeared on Gayle King. Now, the important thing about this story is Oprah reads me. Now, another favorite story of mine was an interview I did with Rue McClanahan. She was about to appear in Dallas with the Sordid Lives cast, including Del Shores, Leslie Jordan, and Caroline Ray. And I said I'd love to interview Rue, even though by that time I was mostly writing news and not arts and features. Rue agreed to the interview, and her publicist said I could have her for half an hour. Rue and I hit it off. She told me a couple of stories off the record. This one was my favorite of her off-the-record stories. She said she was with her new husband, her 6th, at a party after B. Arthur's one-person show opened on Broadway. Her new husband went up to B and introduced himself, and B was a little drunk and said, "Oh, Rue. I always liked Rue. It was Betty White who was a bitch." Well, 2 hours later, Rue and I were still on the phone swapping our favorite Golden Girls lines, and her favorite episode and mine was the one where Dorothy's friends turned Dorothy's friend turned out to be a lesbian who falls in love with Rose. And although Blanche is horrified the friend is a lesbian, she can't understand how she would fall in love with Rose and not with her. And years after the original show aired, Rue gave me her own personal performance of the scene on the phone. Now that weekend, Rue was in Dallas to perform, and when I met her, we hugged and laughed, and that was special because it was her last interview, and that was her last performance before her stroke, and she died less than a year later. And I spoke to Chaz before his appearance here for Black Tie Dinner, and that was a really touching conversation. I reminded him of his appearance on Lambda Weekly years earlier, and asked if it was harder coming out the second time. After I came out as a lesbian, he said, my mom didn't speak to me for a week. After I came out as a man, she didn't speak to me for a year. But the thing that struck me the most was when he said it made him really sad that he'd only get to grow old as a man and never experience growing up as one. He said he was getting quite a bit of criticism from the gay community for hosting a fundraiser for his stepmom, Mary Bono, who was running for re-election to Congress. The gay community's objection, of course, was that Bono and her new husband, Representative Connie Mack, are Republicans. But Mack and Bono embraced him as he emerged as transgender, while Cher refused to speak to him. So he felt let down by his community, as well as by his biological family. Now, I haven't talked about the AIDS crisis and how it affected my life. So many friends that I've lost, but I do have one story about probably the most poignant day in the 30-year history of the Dallas Voice. It was a Thursday evening in about 2000. We were almost done laying out the paper. Dennis looked at me and said, "Oh, we forgot to do the obituaries." And I said, "I don't have any." Dennis said, "I don't have any." Tammy looked, shook her head. She didn't have any. That was the first time in more than 10 years that we had no deaths to report. We looked at each other a little confused, and I can never get through this part whenever I tell the story, but we looked at each other and we all just started crying. So, as a writer and as a broadcaster, the best experience is when my work really makes a difference. When Creating Change was here in Dallas, I interviewed a couple from Iraq that came to the U.S. as refugees. As teens, they had been kidnapped, raped, and left for dead because they were gay. After receiving asylum, they were relocated to Houston, where they were placed in an apartment near other Iraqi refugees, where they were shunned and abused, again, because they were gay. In addition, Catholic Charities, which contracts with the federal government to help provide some services to those who have recently gotten asylum, completely failed them. They're supposed to provide each refugee family with a bed, sheets, table, dresser, chair for their apartment, and some job training to help translate any skills from their home country into a career in this country. This couple got nothing for their apartment. They were sleeping on the floor. They were offered no training. After my story ran, I got a call from the Unitarian mission at the United Nations. They offered to put the couple in touch with a Houston Unitarian church that would make sure Catholic Charities would provide the services they're contracted to provide. I spoke to the Houston Gay and Lesbian Community Center, and they helped the couple find an apartment in Montrose to get them away from the other Iraqis. And I heard from several gays and lesbians with businesses in Houston, and they offered the couple jobs. Now, I've been doing Lambda Weekly once a week for more than 20 years, and over the years, Patty, Laurent, and I have met people who said that when they were a teen or when they were first coming out, they'd put on headphones and listen for an hour and knew that there was somebody like them. One Baylor student told Patty that every Sunday he'd drive from Waco up to Hillsborough, where the station fades, to listen, just to have some connection, just to know he wasn't alone. When I met one person who had listened for years, he introduced himself saying, "You saved my life." And I couldn't imagine what I had done, but he had gotten the message just by hearing a halfway sane group of gay people talking on the air each week, and he got the message that he was okay. And for me, it just doesn't get any better than that.